Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Thomas Howard, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all today to this Westminster Business Forum Policy Conference, looking at the next steps for UK startups policy. Just a couple of things from me before we get started. Firstly, we have opportunities for you to ask questions to all our speakers this morning, and my colleague Ed will run through how to do so shortly. Just as a reminder, could you please say your name and organization before asking your verbal question, as it really does help with the transcript. I'll now hand over to Ed to talk you through the use of Microsoft Teams. Ed, over to you.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. So I'm just going to show you how to take part in today's virtual conference. So first of all, if you like to use captions, these can be accessed by clicking on the three dots under which it says More. Select this, go to Language and Speech, and from there you can turn on live captions, which will automatically start appearing underneath the slides. If you want to view a list of participants to today's meeting, if you just click on the People button, this will bring up a list of everyone present at the right-hand side. That's both presenters and attendees. There's also a chat box available to use. This is just more for general comments and networking. So if you do have any thoughts, please feel free to put them in here. Throughout the morning, there's going to be numerous opportunities for Q&A. So if you do think of any questions, there's a few ways you can do this. So first of all, if you could click on the Q&A bar, you can type your question there. The chair will be monitoring this and then directing the question to the relevant speaker during the Q&A sessions. There's also an option to dial in using a mobile phone, just in case you do have any audio issues. So to do this, yet again, select the three dots under which it says More, select Call Me, type your phone number in, and you can speak to us that way. Occasionally, there's an issue where the slides may become frozen for some delegates, especially after leaving the breakout room. If this does happen, 9 times out of 10, leaving and rejoining will fix it. If this doesn't fix it, however, you may want to rejoin using the browser option. If this does happen to you, just a reminder that slides subject to speaker permission will be shared with the post-event material, so you won't miss anything. Speakers are welcome to redistribute their own contribution in whatever form they like. We just ask that it's not used out of context, and would be grateful if the forum and conference are referenced. All our events are recorded. A recording will be set around post-event along with any slides subject to permission. If you do have any tech issues at all, please contact me, or alternatively, you can call one of the tech support numbers that was given in your email invitation. Just one further point from me as well. If you do leave the event, please make sure to press the red leave button and not the yellow end event button right next to it. So just to repeat, press the red leave button. Okay, so without further ado, we'll move on to, I'm going to hand it back to Tom real quick, who's going to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Ed. Brilliant. Welcome again, everybody. There's been a couple of changes to the agenda, but we are delighted that we will be joined virtually this morning by Blair McDougall MP, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the Department for Business and Trade, who has provided a pre-recorded contribution to open this morning's conference. So now we will hear from the Minister.
A warm welcome to everyone attending today's conference. My thanks to the Westminster Business Forum for bringing together so many small business owners, business representative organisations, and such an impressive array of speakers. I couldn't be more honoured or excited to have been made the new Minister for Small Business. I fully appreciate that this is one of the most important briefs any minister could have. That's because it's no exaggeration to say that small businesses are the backbone of this economy. SMEs make up over 99% of all businesses in Britain. That accounts for 60% of the country's jobs. And they provide a staggering 2.8 trillion in turnover. That's more than our annual education, defence and NHS budgets combined. As a former small business owner myself, I know what it's like to take your future into your own hands. It can be exhilarating, but it can also be extremely isolating. When you're starting out, on top of finding new customers, honing your services, selling your goods, you also have to be your own accountant, employment lawyer, customs officer, IT technician, painter and decorator. I get it, I've lived it myself. I want you to know that this government is there beside you, working every day to make things just a little bit easier and a little bit quicker. That's why over the summer, we published our plan for backing your business, a whole set of reforms to support startups and entrepreneurs. We started with late payments. We've already introduced a new fair payment code rewarding businesses who pay their suppliers promptly. And now we're going to go further. We're legislating on tough measures to stop larger firms dragging their feet. Our Backing Your Business plan also cuts the red tape that we know has been holding our SMEs back. We're cutting the administrative cost of regulation by 25% for all businesses, and we're bringing in brand new hospitality zones with fewer fees and less form filling. We're improving access to finance too by boosting support for a key programme from the British Business Bank. The Enable Guarantee Programme is all about putting government-backed loans within reach of SMEs with less risk for lenders. By increasing its capacity by some £3 billion, we're making sure the full financial firepower of government is behind startups who want to grow and grow fast. Of course, not everyone knows about the help that's out there. No small business owner wants to spend hours trawling through the internet reading about different local and national programmes. So we're sorting that out with the launch of our brand new business growth service, which I know you will be discussing later today. It can be found at business.gov.uk. We want this new service to be a go-to place for support and advice on tax, on hiring new staff, advice on selling abroad. So that's what the government is doing as part of our growth mission. We want to make Britain the best place to start and grow a business. I'm looking forward to working with many of the brilliant organisations represented here today in that effort. That includes the Federation of Small Businesses, the Founders Forum Group, and the Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology. I want to make sure we're pursuing the right pro-business, pro-innovation, pro-wealth creation policies so that our SMEs and our startups can really thrive. Thank you, and I hope you have a thoroughly enjoyable conference.
Thank you very much to the Minister there for his contribution. So moving on to our first live speaker then, it's a pleasure to welcome Anthony Chari, Partner and Head of UK&I Government and Public Institutions Practice at Oliver Wyman, who will be talking about priorities for UK startup policy, driving growth, competition and enabling innovation. Anthony, welcome, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. Hi, everyone. Good morning. As Thomas said, I'm Anthony Chari. I lead our public policy practice in the UK, but I also focus very much on working with government on economic growth and economic development. And I've done a huge amount of work with Treasury, DBT, BBB, UK Export Finance, and a number of other organizations. We actually did work with NatWest last year on mid-market companies and scale-ups, which I will draw upon in this keynote speech. Let me put up some slides just to start the discussion. So today, I'd like to focus on the importance of innovative companies and how they can be supported in the UK. And so I'll first focus on why SMEs and scale-ups and mid-market companies are so important to our economy. It kind of seems obvious, but there are a number of facts that I think are sometimes overlooked about how critical they are. And then we'll move on to talk about the support to innovative companies, and I'll talk about, obviously, the new UK government strategy, the small business strategy, and the different areas of support that will be provided to SMEs, so on financing, talent, regulation, and exports, just to mention a few. So starting with the first part on the importance of SMEs. So the vast majority of UK companies are SMEs and mid-market companies. So you can see here a pyramid representing the different types of companies, with the SMEs really forming the foundation of the pyramid, the mid-market companies in the middle, as you would expect, and the large companies at the top. We can debate the thresholds that we can use. There are lots of different thresholds that can be used, but assuming that SMEs go up to 25 million in turnover, 100 employees, and mid-market companies up to 500 million in turnover and 2,500 companies, which is probably on the higher end of limits, but that's, for instance, how Germany would define its Mittelstand. You can see that we're talking about 2.7 million companies in SMEs, 13,000 MMCs, and about 1,000 large corporates. And what we can see is that they represent 99% of companies, especially the SMEs. MNCs are still a fairly small number. But in terms of employees, turnover, and growth value add, which is kind of a measure of GDP, we're talking about 50 to 75% of our jobs and economy. And on the right-hand side, when we look here at the spread across the country, they're actually even more important when we look at the spread by region. Large corporates tend to be more concentrated, but actually SMEs and mid-market companies are actually quite well represented across the country and represent a key part of employment and GVA for most of our regions. Even more importantly, mid-market companies and SMEs are a critical driver of growth. So as you can see here, you can see the evolution of turnover on the left-hand side. So there's been significant growth, except during the COVID-19 time of all those different segments. But you can see that the growth has been particularly strong for mid-market companies with a 5% growth. SMEs at 4% and large corporates at 3.6%. So maybe contrary to some of the expectations or what people commonly would say, actually SMEs and mid-market companies are the engine of our growth. They're really driving growth more than large corporates are. And on top of that, it's not on the page, but they are actually also a key driver of productivity. So mid-market companies are highly productive and have increased their productivity significantly. So they're twice as productive as SMEs and have been increasing their productivity significantly over the last decade as well. And needless to remind ourselves that not only have they grown strongly, especially during difficult times like COVID and more recently inflation, but they've been very resilient, bouncing back post COVID, and they've been strong across a variety of sectors. Here you can see the split of sectors in which they operate. They're particularly focused on the production sector and the wholesale sector, and whereas you can see large corporates are particularly important more in retail and finance and insurance, as you would expect. So this was kind of a relatively quick overview of why mid-market companies and SMEs are important. Obviously, they're a driver of innovation as well. What's important is to also think about what can we do to support businesses? And as Minister McDowell just mentioned, the government just published its strategy a couple of months ago, Backing Your Business, which is the small business strategy, highlighting 5 areas of priority. And he mentioned a few of those. The first one is to fix the fundamentals, so cutting red tape and ending late payments, which, as Minister McDougall mentioned, the government has started to take action on. The second one, and I'll go deeper in those, I'll go deeper into the ones in blue, is to unlock access to finance. So expanding loans, guarantees, and equity to fuel SME growth. And we've seen that very clearly represented in the spending review, which allocated a significant amount of money to the British Business Bank, which is the development bank focused on supporting SMEs. 3 is to back the everyday economy, ease costs and licensing to revitalize local retail and hospitality. 3 is future-proofing business skills. This was something that, for instance, in the NatWest review we did on mid-market companies came up over and over again as the #1 priority. It's very hard for businesses to find the talent and the skills that they need currently. And 5 is opening up opportunities, and that's supporting SMEs to find advice, support to export, and to be a supplier. What that will mean in practice, if all of those are implemented for SMEs, that it will be clear visibility on cash flows and costs. There will be stronger finance to help them grow and become more productive and invest. Three is there will be better advice and it will be easier for SMEs to navigate advice. So one of the recommendations here is to set up a business growth service within government to advise and centralize advisory services to SMEs. And the last one is to support with identifying talent and skills. So going through a few of those that are particularly important. The first one is finance. So SMEs and especially the fast-growing ones, innovative ones, so moving on from being a startup to a scale-up and eventually a large corporate. We can see here the life cycle of those companies. So you can see the two curves here representing the revenue and profit. So revenue being pre-revenue and then starting to generate some revenue until they start making profit. And so we have in the UK, and we didn't map it to specific tools, but if we map to the entities, you really have UKRI, Innovate UK at the beginning, supporting at the R&D stage with grants and different funding or innovation loans from Innovate UK that help SMEs or innovators pre-revenue to start setting up their business. And then they start having support for angel investing, for instance, from the BBB through early stage VC, late stage financing, and eventually there could be direct investments from the National Wealth Fund, support to export from UK Export Finance, and eventually they might even list on AIM or the LSE. So we can see here the full spectrum and everything exists in the UK. There is support from government across the board, but there are some areas where we probably could be stronger than in others. And this is what this page is kind of showing. It's relatively high level, but it basically compares the level of annual investments relative to GDP in the UK versus the US. And what we can see here is starting maybe from the right-hand side, as you probably won't be surprised, there's a lot of private equity funding and investments in the UK, more than in the US compared to GDP, quite a lot more. And on the left-hand side, you can see that angel investing is actually quite low compared to the US. So that's due to a number of things. I mean, having also all the innovators in Silicon Valley who have sold their companies and continue to invest is probably a driver as to why the US is so high on angel investing. What I find quite interesting is the middle part on venture capital, where the difference is relatively small. In reality, if we could dig deeper into the numbers, but we don't have the time now, you could probably separate between early stage venture capital, which is relatively well funded in the UK, and late stage venture capital, which is less well funded than, say, in the US, and where, for instance, the British Business Bank and the National Wealth Fund are doubling down on at the moment, trying to fill that gap. And essentially, if we could fill the gap at the angel investing and late stage financing, and eventually also enable those companies to list an IPO, which is also a challenge in the UK, we could really, going back to this life cycle, support SMEs right from the beginning where they need grants, which they can get quite well in the UK, innovate, launch their company, have that founders seed funding, grow, scale, and get have that growth equity and continue to be financed until they can IPO. So that's one of the key priorities and the key demands from SMEs and innovative companies. The second one is around talent. Talent is a real challenge. As I mentioned, when we were working with NatWest and the mid-market companies report, it was very clear that this was the number one priority for most of the companies we were speaking with. As you can see here, close to 40% of businesses say that they have difficulty recruiting. And of those, 50% struggle to find qualified applicants. So you can see that's 20% of companies struggling to find the qualified applicants that they need to do their business, which is a real challenge to scale companies. We talk about deep tech, AI, but any company that wants to scale, just increase its production capacity, will struggle. Even for restaurants, that can be a challenge. Two, it creates a real global competition risk. Finding the talent will make the UK less attractive for any startup or scale-up or even large corporates. It will create an investment drag. And it will create regional imbalances, especially if that talent tends to cluster in some areas. And last but not least, regulation. It's something that's come up a lot also in all the interviews we conducted. Um, Innovative scale-ups, as well actually as regular SMEs, really face challenges around regulation. And especially when we talk about mid-market companies, or when companies really start scaling up and become a bit larger, they kind of get squeezed where they're too large to be exempted from regulation, but they're also too small to necessarily have the dedicated staff to deal with the regulation and the red tape that they're subject to. This page kind of summarizes the journey that companies go through in terms of regulations as they grow, in terms of employees, where they are subject to information consultation of employees regulations, health and safety obligations, a number of accounting standards. All of those are useful and important regulations, but they do add up, and sometimes a little bit too early in the growth stage of the company. And it's quite important to give the flexibility for those companies to continue to grow and invest rather than putting too much regulatory burden too early on. So there are a number of things that the government is doing actually or exploring to do this. As I mentioned, there's the Business Growth Service that will provide advisory to SMEs and will centralize all the capacities and the competencies the government is offering. And they're also proposing to simplify regulation for SMEs and cut red tape. So we're looking forward to see how this evolves, but we can see a huge amount of opportunity for companies, startups, SMEs, scale-ups, mid-market companies, if we can tackle all of those issues to unlock more growth and productivity and eventually more jobs for all of us. I'll probably stop here and open to questions if you have any. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Anthony, for that really insightful presentation. We've got around 15 minutes for questions, so please do put your questions either in the Q&A box, or if you can't access that, in the chat. Equally, you can raise your hand and I'll invite you to ask a question verbally. So first question in the Q&A is, do you see the Regulatory Innovation Office as being able to play a role in limiting regulatory burden on SMEs?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. Eventually, I think in the short term, it's going to focus on specific sectors. So right now, at least what was announced was that it would focus on specific use cases. So applying AI in areas that are across departments and with the objective to de-silo innovation. And so some of the examples I think were around healthcare and around climate and greening the economy. I could definitely see in those areas real potential for the RIO to help with that. I think it will help startups and scale-ups more than it will help most SMEs, at least in the short term. That would be my expectation.
And you flashed up some of the sectoral triggers on your presentation when you were talking about cutting red tape. Do you see there being a kind of blanket approach of things that can be done to cut red tape for SMEs across sectors, or do you see it needs to be a kind of more sector specific approach to address kind of some of the challenges that businesses are facing in the sector they operate within?
I'm sure there are sector-specific things, but I suspect it's more important to do it at a segment level than a sector level. So I would say by size of company. I think you would want to focus on SMEs as opposed to mid-markets quite differently. Just going back to the numbers I mentioned, mid-market companies, there's only 14,000 of them in the UK. You can actually target them specifically and really, go to them and talk about exports. What are the opportunities in terms of exports? Tailor probably more the products that we would offer to help them export, as opposed to SMEs where it is a mass market, right? With over 2.5 million companies, you really need to have something much more standardized and than rather than tailored. So I think it's kind of having an element where we differentiate by size of company. And then in parallel, rather than sector, it's more those that are probably more innovative and fast growth, as opposed to the ones that are also very important to the economy, but probably more important in terms of employment and regional productivity. And I would probably create those four buckets and divide it like that, and have a specific strategy for each of those buckets.
That makes sense. Thank you. And I think that leads really nicely into Sheila Scobie's question, who's asked or said there's a lot of positivity about having a strong SME sector, and asked, would it be more efficient for some of those to scale up into mid-market companies and how best to do this?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And when you look at some of the other countries, when you look at, I mean, Germany is the typical example where they have a very strong Mittelstand, which is considered as the backbone of the economy. That's exactly what happened, and it's quite critical to the economy. At the same time, I do think SMEs are really important, and I don't mind having SMEs, and SMEs are the future mid-market companies anyway. And just going back to one of the pages I was mentioning earlier, what we could see was that actually SMEs and mid-market companies were growing faster than large corporates. And so I think that's already happening in a way. But I agree we could help that. I think even more than growth, I would try to focus on productivity. And I didn't show the statistics here, but there are a number of statistics that show that probably our SMEs in the UK are investing less into increasing their productivity. And the level, for instance, of debt and even equity that they raise is much lower than virtually any other OECD country. When we look at the statistics and surveys around their investments and plans, it probably is less ambitious than a number of other countries. I think helping them be more ambitious and take on maybe a bit more risk to invest and increase their productivity and eventually their growth as well, would make a huge impact. When we talk about the productivity issues that we've had in the UK over the last 15 years or 20 years, I do think that actually is one of the keys that would help us solve it.
Thank you. And there's a further question, kind of referring to these buckets that you just mentioned around how to distinguish between more traditional SMEs and innovative startups in terms of challenges and policy.
So in terms of definition, I think I would base it. I mean, the two criteria I would use to distinguish between a traditional SME and innovative startup is around the level of growth. So an innovative startup should have a very fast growth in terms of revenue. It should also start from zero revenue, whereas most traditional SMEs already have a basis of revenue. The second one, which is also what the EU used for their financing, Innofin financing scheme, was the use of patents. I think innovative startups should have some sort of IC or IP that is kind of new. In terms of challenges and policy, I do think they face relatively different challenges. I do think traditional SMEs in particular, what would be interesting would be to help them invest and drive productivity, as I mentioned, and possibly find growth, but kind of challenging them to find new sources of growth and invest to become more productive. Whereas innovative startups are already in that mindset, and I think they face more regulatory issues, and there might be some financing elements, but it's going to be more around equity at the right stages. So angel financing will be difficult for them, but they will find grants for R&D at the beginning. Then they shouldn't struggle too much to get early VC. But when they want to scale, that's usually when we start losing startups. When they start scaling, they start looking at growth equity from the US and then eventually listing in the US rather than the UK. So I think there's slightly different challenges from that perspective.
Thank you. And just kind of I missed a question earlier, anonymous question, sticking with the kind of around innovative startups, or this question is around specifically tech startups. What is the single most helpful thing government could do to support early stage tech startups?
I would think that so. My response is going to be a bit strange because I don't think it's actually necessarily the early stage that we need. I mean, there's the angel investing point that I mentioned, which the government is already trying to solve. But I actually think solving the growth equity issue, which is a later stage issue, will have an impact downstream because it creates better opportunities for exit eventually and better valuations and will and when you look at the life cycle of financing, it's all kind of like a chain of financing, and you can't have one part that is weaker than the other because it impacts the rest of the chain. And so I think if we solve the late stage growth equity funding, which is a real gap we have, I think that would trickle down all the way to early stage startups. So I do think that's a key one. The other one is around skills, although there are now startup visas, which hopefully can help address some of that, but I'm not sure it is at the moment yet.
Thank you. A question from Nadia Ford, who's asked, is there any specific support plan for small and diverse businesses owned and managed by ethnic minorities, women, LGBTQ+, etc., that face additional barriers to growth?
Yes, so the British Business Bank actually looked into that quite a lot in the last few years, as well as DBT, and they're still working on those topics. There are a number of reports actually that we developed with the BBB, and I would invite you to read them about businesses owned by ethnic minorities. I think it was venture capital with women, which is also a topic that the DBT is very much focused on as well, so Department for Business. All with different angles. So some of them are more focused on innovative companies, some of them are more focused on traditional businesses and supporting them. What's very clear is across all of those studies, very clear that that all of those businesses face real challenges to access finance and support. And so it's very important to lean into that. The BBB has done a number of things to start tackling some of those. So they have a number of programs around the startup loans that, in particular, really help ethnic minorities start up their businesses and grow them and develop them. I think in terms of diversity on the investment side, so on the more innovative side, that's a big priority that they have in their selection of funds. So it's not that they have a specific scheme for that, but they definitely are focused on identify when they invest in venture capital funds, they try to, as much as they can, to identify those are more diverse or have an objective to invest in diverse businesses. So yeah, I suspect there's more we could do, but that's definitely an area that people are focusing on and trying to address.
Thank you. And I wonder if you have a moment during the morning, if you could kindly signpost some of those reports in the chat, maybe that'd be helpful for delegates, or if anyone else on the call is able to post a link to those. Thank you. Next question, anonymous question. Are there any plans to re-engage with the European Investment Bank for access to funding and access to EIC pre-accelerator that allocates grants to SMEs between 300 and 500,000 euros? And then commented saying that Switzerland and Iceland have collaboration agreements that allow them to access European capital. This seems more important than ever now as the EU launched its 28th virtual state strategy for startups to scale-ups and scale-ups to access European markets.
It's a really good question. I'm not aware, there might be, but I'm not aware of plans to re-engage on this, but I'm not privy to all those negotiations. I agree that the absence of EIB and EIF in the UK has created a gap. I think the BBB has stepped in quite significantly in the gap that EIF has left. So EIF, just for everyone, the European Investment Bank group consists of two organizations, the EIB group, which is the more of an infrastructure and direct investment into larger, like mid-market and larger companies. And EIF, the fund, which is a bit smaller and does very similar to BBB, does guarantees and invest in venture capital funds. So the BBB stepped in relatively quickly and has been given a lot of capital to step in and support that. So I feel like that angle is relatively well covered. At the same time, I do think the connectivity to Europe is quite important, and that's been a challenge, and you can see that in many ways when when foreign investors want to invest in Europe more broadly. I mean, the UK is very much a priority for them, but not having the same access to Europe or the same or investment funds, like the BBB is very much focused on the UK. That can have some limitations, but I think we've done quite a lot to address that. The other gap is obviously, I mean, that's slightly outside of the scope of SMEs, but the EIB bank, is also that left a real gap in our infrastructure financing, and that's part of the reason why we had the UK Infrastructure Bank and now the National Wealth Fund, is really to fill that gap. But it's a significant amount of gap as well. But I do think the strategy we have is filling the gap in terms of money. I think where we're struggling, well, taking time, is to build the expertise that they had, whether it's in infrastructure or in venture capital. I think we're starting to build all of this, but it's taken us a little bit of time to rebuild it in the UK.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll end on this question around skills. So, anonymous question asking what the steps the government can take to support businesses with finding and developing skills in the workforce. Whether you have any thoughts in terms of some more short-term priorities and then longer-term ones as well.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of things here, and it really depends on the kind of business, but it cuts across all the different areas that you would expect. I think especially for SMEs and mid-market companies and more traditional sectors, I think apprenticeship is a key one. I do think, I mean, it's a sensitive topic politically, and that's why it's so complicated. But I do think visas and work visas are a key part, where in some of the sectors where we struggle to find the skills that we want or at the salary that we are able to offer. I think student visas are quite important, and then finding a way to at least give the opportunity to the people who would add to the economy to stay, and so finding a way to keep the right people. Especially, I think when we talk about startups and innovation, a lot of people do that starting from university. So finding a way to give that opportunity and that stability for people to launch their company while they're students, but then be able to stay longer term and have that stability in the UK. When we look at Silicon Valley, it's not all Americans launching those companies. Many are actually a large number of the entrepreneurs are actually foreigners, starting with Elon Musk, starting those companies. And I think attracting foreigners who want to innovate in our universities and keeping them and giving them the opportunity to grow companies in the UK could have a very significant impact on our growth.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that's a topic we'll pick up a little bit later in the morning as well. Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you as well, delegates, for all of your questions there. Please do keep those coming throughout the morning. So next item on the agenda, there's been unfortunately a couple of dropouts due to illness, but I'm going to hand over to Anthony now, who's kindly going to chair the next couple of sessions up until the break this morning. So Anthony, over to you to introduce the next panel.
Thank you. So the next panel will focus on assessing and implementing the small business strategy. And we'll have two panelists. So Guy Ward, who is a senior science and technology policy analyst at the Tony Blair Institute, and Simon Groom, who is a co-founder and CEO of Magnify B. So maybe I'll hand over first to Guy to give us a first introduction and perspective on the UK's small business strategy.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Anthony, and I'm very excited to be here. So thank you for having me. First of all, I obviously on the panel with Simon, who has far more experience and has a much longer career than me. So I'm very, very honored to be here. I think what I'll try and do is, rather than get into kind of the nitty-gritty of policy now and maybe wait for that in the kind of Q&A section, what I'll do is I'll kind of lay out some of the key strategic questions, which I think can help shape the conversation and debate and some of the questions based on a report that I recently led at the Tony Blair Institute, which is looking at specifically scaling UK tech companies. So very broadly, we all know the government has made some promising steps with the industrial strategy, with the small business plan, with things like the tech adoption review that also came out in the summer. In particular, we've seen further investment into the British Business Bank, for example, We've seen the creation of a new national wealth fund, which has kind of been formed from a couple of pre-existing institutions. We've seen other developments across government in different departments. So, for example, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology has had its AI Opportunity Action Plan that came out early this year, the creation of the Sovereign AI Unit, all of these different announcements and new bodies within government departments are kind of feeding into this. So it's not a case of there's one kind of policy announcement which is relevant. Like, a lot of these things are feeding into this debate. But I think what I would say is, like, especially from an industrial strategy perspective, the key thing to getting industrial strategy right is prioritization. Now, as we all know, that doesn't mean, you know, picking winners when it comes to in terms of sort of individual companies, but it does mean picking sectors. It means picking high growth sectors, having a clear goal, and having a clear sense of what the problem is that the government is trying to solve. Like, what is the market failure in a given instance, and why is the government intervening? So rather than diving into kind of specific policy details now, I'll spend a couple of minutes outlining what I think are the key strategic questions, which I think the government needs to be asking itself, and which I think, you know, it has been asking itself in some ways. But I think in some cases, you know, these questions, especially around goals, can become kind of blurry. So the three sort of questions I think is really important to think about when it comes to industrial strategy in relation to SMEs is, what companies are we talking about? One. Two, what is the actual goal of various different parts of the kind of government intervention and different policy levers that it's looking into? And third and finally, what's the actual problem that's trying to be solved? And what's the problem that's trying to be solved, you know, in different areas where the government is making interventions? So the first is, what types of companies are we talking about? So obviously, of course, all small businesses are very important. Anthony kind of made the case for that very succinctly, and make up a huge part of the UK's economy. But when we're thinking about industrial strategy in particular, the government does have to prioritize what types of companies it should be focusing on. And those have to be the companies which have high growth potential and have the potential to benefit the whole economy and drive productivity and growth. So scale-ups, as we know, make up something like 0.5% of UK SMEs, but generate over 60% of UK SME turnover. So scale-ups are, you know, the types of companies that we should really be thinking about. Obviously, there is nuance here because it's also about thinking about, okay, what small companies, what startups have the potential to become scale-ups, and that's where the kind of industrial strategy side comes in. And so, as I said, while all small businesses are very critical for the UK economy, in terms of industrial strategy, the UK should be prioritizing those companies which can scale, become anchor firms, national champions, reinvest into future companies, importantly, create UK-based jobs, invest in UK infrastructure, and create productivity spillovers. So if we think of, my analogy is that if we think of the UK economy as a rat, where we have, on the front end, we have the head. So I would describe that as kind of your big corporates, your FTSE 100 companies in the UK, your Unilevers, your Relexes, these kinds of companies. The second part is the body, those are your scale-ups. Originally, at one point, they were the tail, then they became the body, and they have the potential to become leading companies at the kind of the head of the rat. And then finally, you have the tail. So these are, you know, as Anthony laid out very succinctly, you know, these make up a large portion of the UK economy. They're small family-run businesses often. And within this category, there are those which have the potential to become scale-ups, right? And my argument is that the UK, especially in terms of industrial strategy, should be focusing on the body, or at least those parts of the tail which have the potential to become the body. And these are the small size companies which have, you know, high growth potential and high spillover effects or potential spillover effects. So that's what types of companies we're talking about, or at least I think what the government should be primarily thinking about. In terms of the second point, so what's the goal? I think especially when we're talking about scaling up small businesses and startups, I think the kind of actual goals of policy can become quite confused, especially in recent years. You know, like, there are more geopolitical tensions. The ability to scale, especially companies in key technology sectors, has taken on like a political element. And as a result, I think we've confused a lot of different things. So we often talk about, you know, listing on the London Stock Exchange, we talk about foreign acquisition, we talk about relocation, we talk about failed access to capital, but these things kind of get lumped together and we don't kind of disaggregate them and figure out, okay, what actually is the goal of government here? What we kind of argue in our report from the Tony Blair Institute is that what really matters is two things. The first is scale. Do these companies have access to the right capital, infrastructure, people, talent to be able to scale? And second, it's about keeping domestic value. So for the policymaker, the point is not to sort of police ownership or listing venues or to kind of block mergers for political reasons. It's about making it rational for companies to be able to scale and embed value at home. And I think this requires some kind of like, reality check in the sense that the UK is obviously a mid-sized economy with a limited market size, right? So if our startups and small businesses are going to become national winners, they need to be global. And so we should encourage firms to expand globally and make it easy for them to do that. But what does matter is that when they scale, they root some of their highest value activities here, whether that's having their headquarters and decision making based in the UK, having skilled jobs here, having taxable profits here, creating dense talent networks, these sorts of things. But I think often the debate becomes politicized and we kind of conflate ownership and value. So I think to give one example to kind of put some flesh on that, one example that I often use is Google DeepMind, right? Which is, I'm sure most people know, is one of the leading kind of well, it's an arm of Google now, but it's leading the way in things like AI for science, and it's run by Demis Hassabis. So Google DeepMind is often lamented as a great loss to the UK economy. That's because it was bought out by Google about 10 years ago. But I would argue it's the kind of thing that should actually be an exemplar of like a major success, or at least a relative success. So, DeepMind is essentially an R&D lab. It's a huge cost. And the fact is it wouldn't be what it is today did it not have the funding from a big tech company like Google, for example. And although, of course, it's foreign owned, which a lot of kind of politicians lament, its central office is still in King's Cross. It's a big contributor to our world-leading AI ecosystem in London. And it contributes very tangibly to a recycling effect, right? Where researchers and scientists who maybe start their career at DeepMind can go on to found other companies. So I think this illustrates the point that like the goal is not protectionism when we talk about scale-ups. The goal is to design policy to make scaling and embedding value in the UK rational for founders. So in other words, nurture the goose, don't hoard the golden egg. So that's what the goal is. I think the final thing is, okay, so what is the problem? Now, obviously, the problem will depend a lot on what sectors we're talking about, what exact size of company we're talking about, what region of the country we're talking about. So there's no kind of fix-all problem. But I would say if there was to be one kind of like source of problems for the UK in terms of startups and small companies being able to scale, it's that most of the problems that face, small UK businesses and startups, especially when it comes to access to capital, as has been mentioned, stems from risk aversion. So our argument at TBI is that the problem is not so much a lack of capital, but a lack of capital mobilization. A US startup will raise 100 million across 2 rounds, and in the other hand, a UK startup will raise 25 million over 4. There's roughly, it's been calculated by the British Business Bank, there's roughly 15 billion pounds of dry powder in UK venture capital at the moment in the UK. Combined UK pensions sit on roughly 5.5 trillion, mostly held in unproductive assets like real estate, passive index trackers, government bonds, etc. So when I say risk aversion, I don't mean some kind of very lofty, like wishy-washy cultural or vibes point, because I think that's a bit of a cop-out as an answer. What I mean is that risk aversion is downstream from poor incentives across the entire scale-up ladder. So from small businesses to scale-ups, etc. To give an example, technology transfer offices in universities often squeeze out a lot of equity from startups rather than giving them the best possibility for early investment. On occasion, R&D tax break schemes, which generally are very strong in the UK, do encourage short-term tax sheltering from investors. And as I mentioned, pensions are encouraged to have high liquidity and therefore kind of low-risk investments compared to other comparable countries. So in this sense, the role of, as I sort of said at the beginning, the role of government is not to pick winners in a company by company basis. but it is to disentangle these incentives which are holding back risk taking in the UK for founders, investors, public investment bodies like the British Business Bank, the National Wealth Fund. But before this, the first step is that we have to be absolutely clear, as I've outlined, what companies we're talking about, what the goal is, and then what the kind of key choke points in the system are that lie. So that's my kind of outline of the three questions. The final thing I would say, before I hand over to Simon, who I'm sure will do a much better job than me, is that I think when we're thinking about government intervention in these different areas, a really key thing to get right is how are we measuring success? And I think one thing that I think about a lot is that when you read, government reports assessing the impact of, let's say, the SEIS, EIS schemes, or all of these things, which are basically like very good and are strong but not perfect. Too often, the government is measuring its success by inputs rather than outputs, and too often that means how much public money has been spent. How many companies, for example, have received support? I think even the small business strategy that came out, I think, was a sort of at fault for this, if you like. It's measuring success by inputs, by money spent, and companies that have received money, rather than what outcomes actually are. So, like, how many companies have we actually helped scale from A to B, or how many companies have we actually helped reduce their time spent on administrative tax tasks and these sorts of things. And so I think one of the first steps the government needs to get right before getting any of these policies right is having a clear sense of how are we measuring success. And a lot of that is very difficult. That requires collecting data. That requires cross-departmental collaboration. And it potentially even requires actually using technology in government to get this right. But I think we're never going to sort out any of these problems unless we can have a clear set of metrics for success and the outcomes we want. So that's my overview of the of some of the things we looked at TBI in our report, and looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Guy. Maybe Simon, who's the co-founder and CEO of MagnifyB, would you mind starting by giving us a little bit of an overview of what MagnifyB does, and then how you're experiencing some of the challenges that Guy and I have been describing so far, because you're really in the first line, really experiencing that.
Absolutely. So good morning, and thank you, Anthony, and thank you very much, Guy, for the kind words. So I think the first thing is MagnifyB was born of a frustration, very much as we're talking about now, with what we saw as a lot of failures around supporting small businesses. So we've been consultants for a long time, particularly I, nearly 30 years, big and small companies. And I realized that one of the big things that we couldn't address was that disparity of support and information at the beginning, and the affordability for small businesses. So my co-founder and my CFO, David, and I sat down about 5 years ago in a hotel during COVID, apart, of course, and we decided that there had to be a better way. So this better way is a SaaS, or a software as a service based AI driven platform that helps small businesses, the smallest, so 1 to 50 staff, to be able to kind of raise their game and get to the stage where they understand what they don't know. So one of the big phrases we use all the time, and I'll use it again in my talk in a minute, is you don't know what you don't know. So really it's to try and help businesses get to that stage with a combination of bringing their management information, their physical finance data in from the various packages, accounting packages available, playing those back in a form of dashboards, helping them understand where they're at, asking them questions, getting under the skin of the business, which is something I've done for nearly 30 years. And then working through to the next stage, which is to benchmark them against their peers, to give them a learning platform into understanding how to do the basics. We're never trying to make people marketers or accountants or anything else. What we're trying to do is to say, this is why these things are important for your business in an affordable way. And then what we've done is built and copyrighted 3 key what if calculators. Basically what that means is the things we used to come across is to say, okay, I've got a business, I want to improve that, I want to change my prices. What's the impact? I want to reduce my overheads. What's the impact? My cost of sale is too high. How do I reduce that? And when I do, what's the impact? Well, we've built these tools to model that within seconds. So rather than having to bounce back and forth with advisors and accountants and others for a great period, that's what we've done. But we've done it in a way that works hand in hand with those advisors, the accountants particularly, and anybody in the coaching or consulting environment. So it's a tool set that's affordable. It's £47 per month. The idea is, and I mention that only because I want to say it's affordable for pretty much any company. And I've attended Wilton Park a few months ago, wonderful conference with the Minister and with others. And actually this subject matter around practical advice and a process to succeed or to achieve goals that are relevant is what we've been trying to deliver. And we've done this recently, launched only about 10 weeks ago. But the point is, 3-4 years in development to get it right and ask the right people and work with government and others, which we are, to try and focus on the right things. So in answer to the rest of it, you mentioned about my comments around this. So Guy and I have been lucky enough to have a chat recently. A big thing for me is that primarily having the right outcomes, excuse me, having the right outcomes and the right goals is absolutely essential. So again, if I may, I'll just kind of go through a few things that I've prepared. And one of the big things for me is that really my background helps me understand what are some of the pitfalls. So, you know, as well as being a tech founder the last few years, I've been a local charity chief executive, a national charity director. I've advised boards from startups to blue chips and charities. I've also worked extensively with government departments and NDPBs. But actually, as a management consultant and business consultant, working with small businesses the last 7-8 years particularly, but on and off before that, I found that some of the big challenges are what we're discussing today, but we've got to change the way we deliver. So I've got perhaps a broad understanding of what makes businesses or organizations tick, and hopefully how to make them succeed. So the UK is home to over 5.5 million SMEs, but 99% of all businesses, and provides around 60% of jobs and over 50% of UK GDP. I think it's 52 last call. They are the backbone of our economy. You know, I've worked for a PLC, a several billion-pound PLC, and I've worked for small companies, but they are the backbone. And when they thrive, the UK economy thrives too. But so many constant challenges in survival, growth, and global competitiveness. So the key challenge is around the fact that 60% of new businesses fail in the first 3 years, I should say. The productivity level is a big indicator. So productivity in the lowest SME performers is just 13% of those at the top of their game. That's massive. So it's a huge disparity, and one we've got to address to obtain a better balance, but also to increase contribution to UK GDP. Now, government statistics say more than half of these failures are down to what they call bad management. In our terms and reality, it's a case of, and I mentioned before, you don't know what you don't know. And again, it's something I preached a lot at the recent Wilton Park event. So with regard to finance particularly, a startup needing maybe £25,000 to get moving may find support through existing channels, but those higher potential startups, those with big plans or international opportunities, and that's Magnify B particularly, right off the bat, often struggle to access the funds at the right stage. As Guy suggested, and I understand why, you know, later stage, I think it was Anthony actually, so later stage opportunities are great. And then Guy said, rightly, that's where we need to get the UK GDP working better, by having companies that are at that stage to get the right equity. However, what I've found, and there's a couple of people I've spoken to recently, one a professor at Edge Hill University, who stated that you're missing the point, everybody, because most organizations have the opportunity, some have the capacity, some have the ability, but most don't have that. If we encourage more of those organizations who've got those good ideas at an earlier stage, it'll work. So if I come back to some of the key things that we've been talking about today, so I think in 2023, only 11.4%, I'm just checking, of SMEs exported. Now, that's a huge untapped opportunity compared with larger firms. So we can expand that export capability and transform the growth trajectories, but it requires practical support and easier routes into other markets, not just a repository of information that busy business owners may not have the time to read. Another stat I looked at relevant to today was in 2023-24, the UK attracted just over 1,500 foreign direct investment projects. And yes, I had to look that one up. These investments usually flow into larger corporates, and we need better ways to connect overseas investors into SME ecosystems. Yes, it happens in some areas, but perhaps developing more better hubs, clusters, and universities support, so smaller firms can also benefit from that capital and expertise in a cohesive and supportive way, needs to happen. But even what exists now needs evaluation and improvement. And then regional balance is always something that comes up in these conversations, and I'm very familiar with it, having worked for nearly 20 years of my career in London, and then I'm based in the Northwest. So 84% of businesses supported by British Business Bank were outside London. That's great. That's a really great start. But too many from that point then still struggle to access affordable growth finance, especially when they're scaling beyond the southeast. So most people look at either London or now abroad to get the finance. And it's improving, but we need to do more. And bridging the gap is essential if we want to encourage national growth. And then the industrial strategy and a streamlined growth service, improved growth service, are massive positive steps forward. I'm a huge fan of the intended outcomes, but what matters, and I said this again at Wilton Park, is the joined up delivery and the practical elements. So support schemes need to be coordinated, I should say, across government. But SMEs need those very simple, practical pathways to use them that come with continuous help and not just for a few weeks or until maybe several boxes have been ticked off for commission services. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, just that we need to change where the outcomes are and whose outcomes we're talking about. So local hubs, universities, entrepreneurs working together, etc., can indeed create these innovation clusters, I think is the phrase, but only if they're designed with the end user in mind and with their goals in mind, not those of the service providers. So entrepreneurship, I'm a huge fan of course, and I spend a lot of my time talking to other entrepreneurs or tech founders, startup founders in different areas as well. And I have a business background, not tech. So beyond finance, it's the confidence and culture and the management information and business intelligence that SMEs need to grow. And simplified regulation is something I've been talking about for a while, and we all want in a way. Easier access to mentoring and a stronger entrepreneurial ecosystem will help us become, the UK again, to become one of the best places in the world to start and scale a business. So many of us want to do that, but are challenged at every milestone. So for me, none of this will succeed without, at scale anyway, without the need or without the right digital infrastructure for SMEs, which is needed. So many small businesses don't fail for lack of ambition at all. They fail because they haven't got the right tools, the insights, and the real-time support that bigger companies take for granted. This is where modern digital systems, platforms like MagnifyB and others come in. They can make enterprise-grade advice affordable and accessible. They can provide forward-looking guidance, not just historic reporting. They can offer always-on support, giving entrepreneurs clarity at the time or at the moment when decisions need to be made, not when it's not timely. And these systems can act as a force multiplier for government policy, helping SMEs improve. And they will need to improve productivity, strengthen profitability, and manage their cash flow. And those are the three key things that any small business needs instantly to succeed. So in short, big company thinking delivered simply and at scale to small businesses. So the message is this from me: policy sets the framework, but digital platforms provide the scalable engine to make growth achievable across potentially all 5.5 million UK SMEs. So I hope we can begin to build a support mechanism of practical tools and a process for growth that actually works alongside, of course, the specialist advice, coaching and consultancy is absolutely needed. I look forward to hearing more ideas and innovation today about how we might do that. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you both. Very insightful. Simon, I actually really like your point around the platforms. I think that's fundamental. It's something I've discussed with a lot of officials in the UK and elsewhere as well, where the Industrial Revolution or any other changes in drastic changes in the economy, whether it was using fertilizers for agriculture or automation, didn't happen because people were experts in chemicals or everybody became an expert in tech. And it's the same with our tech revolution. We need platforms that make it easy. And I think that's exactly what Magnify B does, and a lot of solutions can do that. So I do think this is a really fundamental change. And Singapore actually, interestingly, as a government, created a platform where they really incentivized entrepreneurs and startups to do exactly what you're doing, Simon, which is to create solutions targeted at SMEs to make it easier for them to do the digital transformation and become more productive. What's just Simon, out of curiosity, what's been your experience of doing that in the UK? Were there incentives for you to create solutions for SMEs that kind of have this multiplier effect?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that there's a reason we're in discussion with Singapore, because I'm very familiar with that, and we've been talking to them for over 12 months. Yeah, I think we do have similar intentions and things in the UK that support. So we're very lucky. We're based in the northwest, and one of the hubs, and there's two in the UK, one in Cambridge, one near Warrington in the northwest, and it's called SciTech. So it's Science and Technology Hub, if you like. The Science and Technology Facilities Council supported us through a digital program with a grant to develop more of the AI that we've been developing. So these things exist, but I think what happens is they exist in silos. They're all kind of competing. Whereas I've seen in Singapore and in other areas as well, just talking to a guy where I did a podcast in Canada recently, over in Ontario. They and the US and Singapore and lots of others have a different approach, which is to try and see whether they can give you a pathway, which is what we intend for small businesses with Magnify B. Same principle for people like us who are trying to grow businesses. That's not particularly well thought out and delivered in the UK. So there are lots of incubators and accelerators. And interestingly, we've been told many times, given we're still very small and trying to grow, and just on that beginning of that curve, we've been told many times we're too advanced for the incubators or too advanced for the accelerators. And what they mean is, because of our background in management consultancy and everything else and business support, they think, well, you're going to challenge the people who are giving advice. We will. And actually, we want some of the advice because we don't know everything. But what we want as well is the support, the funding and the ability to get into the right markets. So I think there's a disjointed setup in the UK at the moment. And I say this a lot when I talk at events, and I do a lot of events. And I talk about AI and the use of it. But it's a tool set. You know, AI has to be, you have to remember, it's an enabler, just as Magnify B is an enabler for businesses. And I think for me, we need to kind of switch that. And I said that at Wilton Park in April, I think it was. And I said, look, it's the process, it's the workflow bit that says you need this, 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 and this. And a small business needs to see what they're doing at each stage and get a benefit from it. Look at a goal. Are they achieving that goal? And it's great, rather than, oh, we've done this great stuff, taken off you go. What do I do next? I'm not sure. So I think we do need to beef up what we offer at the moment in the UK. And yeah, it does appear to be far better in other countries at the moment.
Thank you. Just looking at some of the questions, I think related to what you were saying, Simon, and I'd be curious to also hear, Guy, your perspectives on that. Carol asked, what are your thoughts on the support for pre-startups and the point where individuals first test, shape, and build confidence in their ideas, like the business growth service, signposts to organizations that don't necessarily offer that face-to-face support, which can be less crucial?
Yeah, so I think straight away, I work with the growth company, business growth service, and I try and make sure that what we're trying to do fits what businesses need. What I don't do is try and fit existing commission services, which you can imagine, we can't do that. But I think that coming back to the incubator thing again, so if you are and again, absolutely understand the need, and this is how it should be for small businesses. If you're a kitchen table type business starting to think about new things, there are things out there and it works really well. And you've got the likes of the Federation of Small Businesses with lots of things behind it. And again, I mentioned SciTech and others. There's lots of bits around there. The incubators and accelerator programs, some of the banks which we've been part of, they help with things. And then you get to a certain stage and you have the big ambitions and the big plans, and you can see where that's going. And like us, you've attracted a C-suite of people who really know what they're doing. That's when it falls down. And I think what we need to say, so in answer to Carol's question, the services are out there at the beginning and they're quite good. Once you get to a certain stage, you've got to pick and choose really carefully. You have to know a lot more. This, you don't know what you don't know to navigate that. So one thing I will say is there are people out there in part of those groups we mentioned who can support some of this. And if you ask the right questions and get their time properly, they'll steer you towards the right things. But it's not enough, and it's not in every area of the UK yet either.
I think just to comment on to something that Simon had mentioned as well. I mean, obviously, a lot of what Simon's just been speaking about is to do with technology adoption, right? And as Anthony put, like, exactly right. You know, most of the productivity gains we see from technology don't come from their invention; they come from like cross economy adoption and diffusion, right? And I think this is a particularly difficult area of policy for governments. I think when we're talking about things like access to finance, the equity gap, these sorts of things, although also difficult in their own right, of course, I think at least in those areas, there's a kind of clear market failure in certain cases. There's a clear kind of impetus for government intervention, and there's also kind of key, clear bodies that are responsible for helping to fill that gap. So the British Business Bank, the National Wealth Fund, and obviously schemes that have been around for a while, so R&D tax breaks and the EIS, SEIS schemes, all these sorts of things. I think one of the problems is that, when it comes to tech adoption and diffusion, for example, I think recently an OECD survey came out saying that the UK economy was ranked 35th globally for tech adoption, which is well behind where we rank in terms of actual innovation. And I think it's a difficult area for intervention for the government, because I think it's difficult to pinpoint what is the market failure, like why is this not happening? And I don't necessarily have the answers for that. But I think obviously a few kind of areas that sort of the government thinks about in this is in terms of information asymmetry. So is it because there's not enough access to information for people who are just starting their first business? I think the difficulty with that is, the fact is, there are services like, Magnify, which offer some of this information. And so I think the government then has to ask itself, okay, like, is this a role for government or is it not? And I don't have the answer to that, but like, it's a difficult question. And then I think, so there's information, which is a question, but then there's also kind of, to what extent is lack of adoption a kind of result of broader problems in the UK economy? So then you can get into questions of like, is it about market dynamism? Like what's going wrong to like not enable like maybe the kind of the level of competition that would usually spur on tech adoption to drive productivity for different companies. So I think it's all I'm essentially saying is that I think on the kind of industrial strategy side, things like access to finance there's a more clear role for government. And I think although there is obviously a role for government when it comes to technology adoption, it's a much more difficult one to get right. It's not helped by the fact that the government probably has too many overlapping schemes, which, as Simon said, aren't well coordinated and all these sorts of things. But it's also just inherently a more difficult area. And, countries like Singapore, are at a massive advantage because it's a city state essentially. So it's much easier to do these kinds of things. And they have done some very successful schemes. They had a program called the 100 Experiments program, which they did, I think, last year or the year before, where they essentially kind of found 100 companies which were struggling with like logistics or different parts of their business operations. They matched them with AI software engineers in Singapore, and they kind of demonstrated how the integration of AI could help with faster delivery services, all these sorts of things, and that was quite successful. But it's difficult to know where to spend the money on.
Actually, Guy, earlier you mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, and which I've heard a few times, which is risk aversion. It's a recurring topic in many of these discussions. And I kind of always wonder two things. One is risk aversion on which side? Is it the entrepreneurs, the SMEs, the investors? And two, is that really an issue? Is that something we're telling ourselves to because we want to blame people for not behaving the way we would like them, but actually it's just the incentives aren't there? It's kind of an open question. Happy to hear both of you.
No. I mean, so exactly. I mean, I think and I hope it didn't come across like this. When I say risk aversion, I don't mean it's not about blaming entrepreneurs or investors. It's to say that we, I think, have created, or frankly, the government over the past 20 years or so has, although well-intentioned in some cases, created incentives which don't quite work, I think. And you see that across everything from like early stage R&D tax credits to, obviously UK pensions, which is a big debate today. But you also see it in terms of things like the MiFID regulations, which have definitely diminished the amount of like research analyst coverage that we have in kind of niche sectors. And that's a big problem for small businesses, right? Because if you're a small startup in a kind of niche tech sector or a deep tech sector, you're just not getting the analyst coverage. So even if you go and list on Pisces, like you just might not get the coverage. And so that's a big problem. But I think when it comes to risk aversion, look, like this is not. I think the other thing to remember is like there's no single lever the government can pull to solve all these problems. There are lots of different choke points across the scale up ladder where there are incentives which aren't quite right. And so this is a sort of systems problem. And systems problems are obviously always the things that are the most difficult for the government to actually resolve because it requires a lot of cross-departmental collaboration. This isn't just owned by DCIT or DBT or the Treasury. It's like a combination, or Department of Work and Pensions. Like it's owned by all of them. Just to your point, I don't think it's a problem with like lack of risk aversion actually on the ground when it comes to entrepreneurs. Like as Simon said, like there's a lot of people who want to set up their own businesses. But I think, whether we're talking about small businesses, family-run businesses that, are never intending to scale, but like are contributing massively to the UK economy in aggregate, or whether we're talking about, the next potential big tech company, the fact is both, like we need, for both of those types of companies, we need to make their risk worthwhile. And so whether that's things like stamp duty and capital gains tax, or whether it's things like, employee national insurance, right? I mean, that affects small businesses in the UK, whether they're looking to be scale ups or not. And I think, we have to make it worthwhile to take the risk. Where, in the US, you see, everything is done by power laws. VC investors are, spreading their bets across 20 companies, knowing that it will only be one that will make them their big return. And I think, the government has to kind of essentially map out what are the key 10 choke points across this scale up ladder, which will affect both, as I said, small companies, but also those that are looking to become big. And so, yeah, risk aversion is very much downstream from incentives, not something that's like inbuilt into British culture. I don't buy the kind of vibes culture argument. It irritates me deeply.
I mean that to be provocative, but
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Simon.
Yeah, so I mean, I love that guy, and it's entirely right that the risk aversion isn't at the entrepreneur level at all. So one big thing for me, and I preach about this a lot. So there's a need for a review of the risk appetite for equity and debt finance for startups in the UK. There really, really is. Applying bank level risk, which is what happens almost every time, to government guaranteed loans and investment is not going to encourage the growth of high potential startups. I've said it many times in many, many events, and I've said it face to face to VCs and others. I've also said it recently, if I may, to Innovate UK. So again, if we look at the processes that are available for us, on the mechanisms available for us to obtain debt funding, whether it's Innovate UK loan or whether it's grants through Innovate UK, and I'm using that as an example, Innovate UK, it doesn't really matter what the problem is that you get to a certain stage after going through 3 or 4 rounds of different things. And then what happens is you're evaluated based on, let's say on the Innovate UK loan side, on your ability to pay the loan back. Great. We understand it's right. It's the right thing to do. Anyone with any sensible finance head would say, right, got to do this. However, you're a startup. You perhaps got limited MRR, so monthly recurring revenue. You've got big plans. You've got a great pipeline. You can show a several year forecast, which gives you all the details. And even as we did, my co-founder David built in a stress testing mechanism. So you could say, what happens if we only achieve 25% of our goals, of our intended licenses? Okay, well, you do that, and it proved that we could pay a loan we applied for back without problem. We were turned down because they didn't believe we could pay it back over the period. And the reason is, and you listen to what was being fed back to us, it's bank level risk to things that aren't banks and things that aren't actually dealt with in the same way that the other financial institutions would do. So, the idea is it's to encourage growth, it's to encourage startups, it's to take a punt, as they say, on businesses with something concrete behind them and a very structured way forward. And we find that everyone tells us that's what we have in terms of a structured forecast and development plans, etc. We're just an example of many organizations that come across this. And so I think the biggest challenge for us at the moment is absolutely to discuss, review, and to change that risk aversion, that mechanism for risk appetite that seems to be, let's call in the ex-banker, which I get, but then apply the same risk as he or she might have done in the bank. That can't happen if it's supported by a British Business Bank, if it's got funds that are government guaranteed. Why are we doing those things? So that's my challenge to people and to government at the moment. If that's happening, which I know it is, and I see it all the time, it happened to us, why aren't we shifting from that to say, like other countries, right, well, this is the bit where we take a pump. This is the bit where we need everything in place. These are the mechanisms for supporting businesses who can prove MRR and growth already in the last 2-3 years. What about the ones who can show you that they've got potential massive return on investment, but they can't get past the next stage until they get some funds on, until they grow slowly to get to the point where the revenue pays for it? So that's my challenge. I think that's a big issue at the moment.
Hey, we've got 3 minutes left, but I just wanted to put 2 questions forward that have come up multiple times in the Q&A. One is around relocation. What are we doing today that isn't regulation that is pushing businesses to relocate? And I'd be curious, Simon, to hear your thoughts on that, given that you're in one of those companies that could be filling those forces. The second one is around support. The support is currently very focused on larger SMEs and high growth companies. What do we do about micro SMEs that aren't at this stage yet that are also very important to our economy?
Okay, relocation, absolutely. We've absolutely considered this, and it may be the answer. We wanted to try and do things locally, which means, UK. We are trying to do that. We're getting support in many areas, and we're gaining traction in terms of being able to get the product out there and getting some really great feedback. In terms of the investment, it's very, 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 very hard. It's I've done £100 million M&A in the past with Serco. We used to work for PLC, and then coming to ask for a small amount of money in your own business is like asking for an arm. So I think that forces you to think differently, which is why after the conversation recently with the Canadian team, they would put me in touch with the US team who've got the funding. You've got to consider that, hence the conversations with Singapore, approached by someone in Madrid and Spain, etc. So we're having those conversations. So absolutely, it's a challenge. Whether you relocate specifically depends on how you set things up, and it also depends on your type of business. We're not requiring a warehouse, an engineering factory, or anything else. We're tech. We run it on one of the big platforms, so it's fully secure. We adhere to all the right regulation in terms of the ISOs, etc. That's all we need to worry about in a way when it comes to relocating. So it depends on whether we have to follow the money, because at times when you scale, you have to. That's the way it works. If that happens, then we're happy to do so. At the moment, that's not such a big issue. The support for micro SMEs, by the way, big fan. I preach this a lot. I talk to the FSB and others about this on a regular basis. My point before about scalability and about supporting those businesses that aren't perhaps at the level where we're able to get funding for high growth, it's that first stage. That is absolutely what's missing, and I am referring to some of the micro SMEs. Now, admittedly, as we said, there are a lot that don't want to scale, still need support in a way that helps them maintain what they're doing. But I think we're right in that we have to support more those who are trying to scale and make a positive impact on UK GDP. So I think that's the difference there. I do think things are missing for those micro SMEs that want to scale. I think they exist for those that want to remain as they are. I think you need to look in the right place, which is not easy and shouldn't be your problem, but it is one of those things. Maybe better signposting, which I know government are addressing at the moment, is what the answer to that one.
I think just to kind of add to that as well, I think that there's obviously a few reasons why companies might relocate. The first might be that let's say most of their investors are coming from, for example, the US. I mean, it's definitely the case that once UK companies reach about Series A or Series B, a much higher proportion of the investment they're receiving is coming from foreign countries. And obviously that's a difficult issue because on the one hand, we definitely want that foreign investment, and it's much better that we have any investment than none at all. But obviously, if a disproportionate amount is coming from California or VCs from the US, then that obviously contributes to those companies then decide they want to be near their investors. The second is like access to market. So obviously, if you relocate, there are benefits and kind of ecosystem benefits in terms of access to your buyers. I think I don't have sort of specific policy solutions here, but like obviously the UK does need to be a place where we can, where companies can, access global markets. And obviously, like post Brexit, there were frictions for UK SMEs when it came to access to the EU market. And then the other is infrastructure. So I think infrastructure is obviously a very big one. As Simon said, it massively depends what type of company you are. If you're a software company, it's like not very capital intensive, perhaps less likely. But if you're a capital intensive company in the UK, I mean, to give an example, I'm doing a bit of work on the UK sort of quantum strategy at the moment. And one thing that definitely is a problem is that the UK is second in the world for the number of quantum startups, just behind the US. So incredibly good. But when you zoom out and look at the broader kind of quantum stack, the kind of enabling infrastructure like advanced packaging facilities, these sorts of things that quantum computing companies, for example, they need access to scale when eventually quantum computers become commercially deployable. We just don't have that in the UK. And suddenly when you include those factors, countries like Germany, Denmark, Canada, Australia, the Netherlands do way better than us. So we're not even talking about competing with the US and China there. We're talking about competing with Europe essentially. And so infrastructure is obviously a big one, and that comes to some of the more fundamental problems in the UK, which is energy costs, which is planning permission, and the government's trying to do, for example, the kind of AI growth zones policies, which are part of the AI Opportunities Action Plan, is the sort of attempt to make it easier, for example, to build data centers and these sorts of things. But if we want to be a sort of AI-driven economy, that is going to be very important, especially for startups that don't have access to the capital. I think the final thing as well is I've had a sort of slightly gloomy chat with a US VC investor last week, and he made the sort of gloomy point. He was like, I was sort of asking him, I was trying to get a sense of, why is there not that much corporate venture capital in the UK? So why do we not have big US corporates setting up kind of CVC arms in the UK to invest in, obviously we have a lot of really innovative startups. So why do we have, I think the UK has something like 10% of the UK's VC as CVC compared to the US, which is like 30%. And what he said was that it's much cheaper for US companies to buy UK companies than it is to invest in them. And that is a big problem if you think about it, in the sense that much easier for a big US tech company or big corporate to wait until a sort of great UK company reaches Series B and then just come out and buy it. And it's much easier for them to do that than to set up a whole operation in the UK to invest in companies from an early stage. And so a lot of the relocation is obviously the result of just being bought out. And I'd say that's the biggest problem. If there's not a clear value for foreign companies investing or foreign VCs investing in the UK, then that we're getting the worst of both worlds basically.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, I think, and a very big driver to those relocations. Well, thank you both for this panel. I thought that was really insightful, really interesting, and a really nice segue actually to the next um, discussion, which is from Madhush Gupta, the chair of CFIT, the Center for Finance, Innovation and Technology, and who will talk about opportunities for innovation and technology and unlocking startup growth. Madhush, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that really interesting session. Thank you to the brilliant Westminster Forum for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to talk about the opportunities for innovative technologies to unlock startup growth. My name is Madhush Gupta. As Anthony mentioned, I'm the acting chair for the Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology. But I want to begin with a fundamental truth about entrepreneurship and innovation. There is no silver bullet for successful startups. Technology may help entrepreneurs test and learn their products and market fit quicker, fail faster, iterate more quickly towards success. But so can everyone else. Technology makes everything a sprint finish today. So it makes things easier, but far, far faster. So what separates successful entrepreneurs is not just the technologies they use, the enablers, but how startup entrepreneurs weaponize these innovative tools through collective curiosity and relentless tenacity. Today, I'm going to share how this philosophy drives our work at the Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology, and what it means for the future of startup growth in the United Kingdom. CFIT has proven impact building coalitions that solve real problems. CFIT, the Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology, was established by HM Treasury and the City of London Corporation just over 2 years ago, but not to chase technological trends, but to solve real problems that constrain entrepreneurial success and growth in financial services. Our coalitions bring together diverse stakeholders who refuse to accept the status quo. Entrepreneurial businesses facing real barriers, banks struggling with operational challenges, regulators monitoring market failures, and government agencies that are understanding economic impacts. Plus, of course, those innovative fintech companies building those solutions. So, let me tell you what we've achieved together. Our Open Finance Coalition exemplifies how collaborative problem solving creates tangible benefits. We assembled over 60 partners united around one insight. Good, brilliant SME businesses were being declined financing due to their credit records based on incomplete data. Data for SMEs that makes up the majority of their expenditure. Banks recognized operational inefficiencies. Entrepreneurial businesses experienced funding barriers. Regulators saw market failures. And government understood the economic impacts of all of this. Collectively, we identified that traditional credit assessment overlooks critical indicators of business reliability. Things like business rates payments, rent history, utility bill payments, wage payments, data points that actually demonstrate the operational stability, the credit reliability of these startups and SMEs. The breakthrough came from collaborative curiosity across the ecosystem. Our proof of concepts with HSBC, Experian, IBM, and others succeeded because banks, fintech companies, regulators, and other entrepreneurial businesses work together to solve a shared problem. And what's the result? We've proven that 25% of SME loan applicants who would have been declined can justifiably gain access to credit when lenders have access to better data sets to enhance credit report building. But the impact goes beyond lending. We've enabled citizens' advice to support an additional 150,000 financially vulnerable people annually, helping them to access, on average, £1,000 in extra support per year. That is incredible. That is the opportunity of technology applied to real-world SME business problems. Secondly, our work supporting digital company ID, digital verification, demonstrates how technology amplifies collective determination. But we didn't start with digital identity technology. We started with a coalition frustrated by two interconnected problems. Entrepreneurial businesses facing friction in business onboarding, and the entire ecosystem bearing the cost of economic crime due to poor verification. Leading a coalition of 70 partners, we collectively discovered that businesses face up to 150 questions when opening a bank account. Most of those questions would not arise in a world where digital verification for startups and SMEs overcame those hurdles. And as significantly, we identified that fraud related to companies cost the UK economy £6.8 billion annually. Our collective approach brought together different perspectives. Entrepreneurial businesses experiencing the friction, banks bearing the compliance costs, regulators and law and order seeing the fraud problems, and government understanding the economic drag. Together, we have the tenacity to map every touch point, understand every verification requirement, and persist through regulatory complexity. The technology provides digital verification capabilities, but collective drive across the ecosystem identified the scale of the problem and refused to accept it as unavoidable. CFIT's research, our research, shows that digital company ID could add £1.7 billion annually to GDP through reduced compliance costs and fraud prevention. The coalition didn't stop at identifying the problem. Banks provided operational insights. Entrepreneurial businesses shared customer experience data. Regulators contributed compliance expertise, and government offered policy frameworks. Together, we built proof of concept systems that major financial institutions now wish to deploy. And we see that in the follow-up to our digital verification work. And looking forward, we've been working closely with the Small Business Commissioner, Emma Jones, to highlight the opportunities where CFIT can help solve other business problems, critical problems, for example, around late payments and how open finance, open banking techniques can help support more rapid payments, supporting better cash flow. Late payments that devastate the lifeblood of small businesses. So using the same collaborative coalition approach, we're looking to solve these problems in lending and fraud prevention. Together, these demonstrate CFIT's ongoing commitment to solve the systemic problems that constrain entrepreneurial growth in financial services and across the SME startup ecosystem more broadly. Now I'd like to explore the SME Finance Task Force, where CFIT provided the Secretariat, to understand the £22 billion funding gap for startups and SMEs. Our SME Finance Task Force reveals how collaborative intelligence drives breakthrough insights. We assembled 40+ organisations to answer a critical single question. one that impacts all SMEs and startups. Why is SME lending declining despite abundant capital availability? The coalition uncovered that 50% of declined SME loan applicants don't seek alternative lenders after that initial application. That's appalling. That is deeply impactful to growth across the United Kingdom. We also found that success rates at traditional incumbent banks had fallen to 1 in 2 applications. We already knew that, I guess. But here's the crucial insight. We identified a £22 billion SME funding gap that isn't just about a lack of capital. It's driven by information asymmetries, preventing lenders from properly assessing risk, credit risk. Banks provided lending data. Entrepreneurial businesses shared their funding barrier experiences. Regulators contributed market oversight. And fintech companies offered alternative approaches. The task force revealed that high-quality data exists in abundance. HMRC data showed business performance. Companies' house information demonstrating compliance. Cloud accounting platforms that are now mandatory for SMEs and startups, capturing all of the color in all of those businesses. And payment systems showing transaction patterns. When you bring all of that data together, you create the most incredibly rich data set. It's incredible. But the challenge isn't about creating data. The data's there. It's about how you access that data. Both to publicly held data, where barriers are primarily technical, and privately held data, where both barriers are technical, but also commercial. These barriers are not insurmountable when entire ecosystems work together to solve them, supported, mandated by government. We're really grateful for the government mandate from Treasury, from DBT to support our work. Finally, for the last bit of this session, I just wanted to think a little bit about technology and how other technology type solutions can amplify speed. Notably, areas like AI. Now, here's the paradox we face. Whilst innovative technologies democratize capabilities, all of your competitors have access to exactly the same tools. Everybody, every SME, every startup can do so much more with less. There's been much hype. Artificial intelligence, the great accelerator. And indeed, AI is revolutionizing how startups can build, research, and deliver. They can build faster. AI enables startups to automate routine operations that traditionally consumed incredibly precious, scarce resource. They can deliver customer support through intelligent chatbots available 24/7 instead of standing up a call center. AI can support content creation at pace for marketing without expensive agencies. And then we can test and learn those campaigns doing A/B testing very quickly in an automated fashion. AI can enable low-code, no-code, and code generation at pace, reducing development and testing times. AI can also support financial modeling and forecasting across the ecosystem without bringing in expensive consultants. AI helps an entrepreneur, a startup, an SME research quicker. AI transforms how startups understand markets and customers. Through predictive analytics, market analysis, processing vast data sets instantly. No, not just local data sets, but global data sets. It can provide competitive intelligence gathering and synthesis, all depending on how you train the model. and real-time sentiment analysis of customer feedback. These are incredible facets of AI, but we mustn't forget every single firm, every single one of your competitors has access to the same. AI also enables us to flex delivery. It enables startups to scale operations very dynamically. It can provide personalized customer experiences delivered at scale. Really the future of customer experience and service. It can provide automated supply chain optimization, responding to demand, and dynamic pricing strategies that in previous times we could not dream of, even the Amazons of the world who are experts in this. It can also provide flexible resource allocation based on predictive models. But here's the critical insight. When everyone has access to these AI capabilities, competitive advantage shifts. The success doesn't come from having the tools. It comes from learning appetite from our entrepreneurs, that constant mastering of new capabilities faster than our peers, our competitors. It comes from integration discipline, how we connect those AI tools into coherent ecosystems that compound advantages. It comes from the tenacity of our entrepreneurs. This country has produced incredible entrepreneurs for hundreds of years. It also comes from iteration speed, testing and refining approaches more rapidly than the market. But here's where our CFIT experience becomes crucial. Individual startups using these technologies well will succeed, but entire ecosystems using them collectively will dominate. So to our policymakers, we need to build on the UK's systemic advantages. The opportunity is clear. When technologies are globally accessible, competitive advantage comes from ecosystem quality, the tenacity, the enduring tenacity of our entrepreneurs. We need regulatory frameworks that enable systematic deployment advantages. We need to expand sandbox programs beyond individual technologies to support integrated solutions. We have to accelerate smart data legislation and the availability and access of that data, creating comprehensive information advantages that we are really only starting to realize today. And we need to provide AI governance clarity that enables innovation whilst managing risks. Technology makes everything a sprint finish. In some ways, it makes life harder, more demanding for our startups, our scale-ups, for our entrepreneurs. Everybody has to be a sprint finisher now. My call to action to our parliamentarians on this call: create conditions where our most determined entrepreneurs can leverage democratized technologies more effectively than anywhere else globally. And to our industry leaders, join our CFIT coalitions that solve problems systematically and build infrastructure advantages that benefit entire ecosystems. Let's ensure the ecosystem is built here in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Meadows. Thank you for this very inspiring and insightful highlights of the opportunities for innovation, technology, and unlocking startup growth. Just one quick question. I was wondering, just from your perspective, what do you think will be the greatest change to UK businesses from all the technological changes we're seeing now? You mentioned AI, for instance, and you were kind of giving us inspiring visions of what that could change. What do you think is going to be the biggest change in the next 5 years for UK businesses?
I think the biggest change is the need to learn to upskill around these technologies, to learn to use them. And so clearly those entrepreneurs, startups, scale-ups that learn to apply these technologies brilliantly are the ones that are going to win in this race. And that upskilling applies to all startups today, rather than just the ones that wanted to really do things very differently. You know, the world is changing very quickly, and only the most capable, active entrepreneurs that have their biggest ambition to learn, to upskill, are going to succeed.
Very, very interesting. That's great. Well, I realize we're getting to the end of the time we have for now until we have a short break. Just wanted to just take a step back from all the conversations we've had so far. We've covered a lot of ground this morning. I think, I mean, looking back, we've talked about quite a lot about the importance of small businesses, where there are startups, scale-ups, or SMEs who are looking to grow and invest. They all represent really the backbone of our economy in terms of jobs, in terms of growth, productivity, and innovation. But as we said, we need to lean in, and it's a collective effort, whether it's investors and lenders, entrepreneurs, governments, corporates. We talked about corporate venture capital. Um, all of all of us need to really lean in and support entrepreneurs and companies in driving growth and productivity and innovation. And that's across a number of topics. We talked about capital and financing for companies, simplifying regulation. We talked about skills and access to talent. All of these, cutting red tape, providing advice and helping with exports or finding investors. All of those are key actions where we can lean in and support our businesses. Hopefully this conversation so far has given you some highlights of the key themes that we're seeing so far, that the government has highlighted in its strategy, and where the path forward might be for the next few years in the UK. And I think that's it for this morning. Thank you for your time. I think there's a short break now until 11. Teddy, Thomas, yeah, I don't know.
Yes, thank you so much, Anthony. Yes, we'll be taking a short break now until 11:05, and we'll resume the second half of the morning. But again, just a thank you to all of our speakers for the first half, and to Anthony for chairing that. Thank you. So yeah, short break now, and we'll see you back in sort of 12 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.